Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. The next thing I do is remove the hubcap, assuming you have one. Now once that's out of the way, continue on to removing all 4 of your 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now with the wheel out of the way, we're going to continue on to using some penetrant. I'm going to use penetrant along where the axle nut is. We'll also use penetrant up along this area. And now, if you were to follow the flex hose to its mounting bracket, spray down that mounting bolt as well. While that's sitting and doing its job, continue on by using one of your lug nuts and put it up against the rotor. Essentially, it's going to hold it in place so it doesn't wobble around on us while we continue. Now we can continue on by removing our axle nut. To remove this, you want to use a 12-point 30mm socket. Apply some penetrant in the area, continue with a hammer and punch right in the center here. We're trying to break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Let's make our way to the bolt that holds the flex hose and ABS wire to the strut. We'll use a 14mm to remove that mounting bolt. Make sure you break both of these free from the strut. Now you can either use a small screwdriver or a pick. We're going to come over to this ABS wire mounting point. Carefully get under the area and separate it. Make sure you've got plenty of slack from your ABS wire. It's extremely important. Now we're going to continue up to the mounting bolts that hold the strut to the knuckle. I'll use a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket to remove the pair. I like to leave the top bolt in while I continue on to the bottom. Now that we have the mounting nuts off of there, we're going to continue on to removing both of these bolts. But before we do, once again, you need to make sure that you're paying special attention to the ABS wire and your flex hose. Once we remove these, we're going to carefully start pulling this down towards us. You don't want to put a tug or damage either of these wires/hoses. Now that we have that separated, continue on by pressing on the axle stud that's coming through the bearing. We're going to try pressing it through the rear. While I'm doing that, I'm going to be coming from the rear, holding on to the CV joint. Carefully start pulling the knuckle down, but we're paying attention to the flex hose. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put this back up here and hold it in place with something as simple as a bungee cord. The next thing I always like to do is use a safety strap of some sort. Tie it around the axle and bring it all the way up to the strut. After that, we're going to continue by getting underneath the vehicle and carefully separating the axle from the transmission. The reason why we have the safety strap is so once it does pop out, it can't potentially fall and hurt us. The next thing that we're going to want to do is put a nice collection bucket underneath the area where the axle goes into the transmission. Once you have your collection bucket under the area, we're going to continue on with a hammer and a pry bar and carefully get in between this area of the subframe and the transmission. I'm going to try to put the pry bar directly up against the notch that's on the axle. Once I get it on there, I'll give it a couple loving bonks to break it free from the transmission. Once it's apart, I'll give you a closer view. Go ahead and remove your axle. There it is, friends. Now with the axle out of there, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the transmission where the axle goes in. You're going to find that you have a rubber axle seal there. Go ahead and wipe it down, give it a close inspection. If it needs to be replaced, now is the perfect time to do it. Okay friends, now it's time to install our brand new axle. As we make our way to the inboard end, you're going to notice that it's shaped differently than the outboard end. It has a shaft right along here before the splines. It also has this area to help protect that seal. Once you have it in the proper placement, go ahead and slide it into the vehicle. While we put it into the transmission seal, you want to be extremely careful not to damage the seal. Now as you start pressing it in, you're going to notice that it seems as though it wants to get stuck before it's pressed all the way in. That's because it has a locking ring. You just kind of essentially need to give it a couple loving bonks and it should want to slide right in. If you do have to use a hammer, make sure it's a rubber mallet. Now, as I was driving that in, I could hear an audible difference towards the end. That essentially means that it popped into place. I'm going to double check by reaching in, grabbing onto the axle, not to the boot, and try pulling it out. So I'll make my way all the way in here to where the transmission is, grab onto that inboard axle area, and give it a tug. Assuming it doesn't come out, you should be good to go. Now before we put the outboard end into the wheel bearing, make sure you coat it with some copper never-sees along the splined area right here. Now we can carefully grab the axle and we're going to slide it in through the back of the wheel bearing. Now with that back there, I'm just going to continue on by wiggling it around. We're going to wait for it to come out through the wheel bearing hole. Now while it starts coming out through there, we're also going to pay attention up along this area. We want to make sure that we line up our mounting bolt holes of the knuckle with the mounting bolt holes on the strut. But while we're doing it, you also need to make sure that you do not damage the ABS wire or have it put in a place that it shouldn't be. The next thing we're going to do is clean up the threads on our 3 mounting bolts. Once you clean each of the 3 bolts, continue on by applying red thread locker to the 2 larger bolts and copper never-sees to the smaller bolt. Now we can take our larger bolts and we'll start them through from the rear towards the front. Start on each of your mounting nuts. Once you have both of these started, go ahead and bottom them out. After that, we'll torque them to manufacturer's specification. Now let's torque these to 97 foot-pounds. Now we can continue with mounting our flex hose and our ABS wire. Now for the ABS wire, you want to put that bracket on first. Looking at the bottom, you can tell you have this tab that protrudes out. That needs to fit into this area. Slide it right in there, slide it up. That lines up that bolt hole. Now we're going to continue on with the flex hose. That pretty much just sits right down over it. After that, you can put in your mounting bolt and snug it up. Give it a wiggle, make sure they're both secured. Let's make our way along the other side of the strut. We'll make sure the ABS wire is secured over here as well. Now it's time to reinstall our axle nut. You'll notice on my axle shaft, I went ahead and I put some red thread locker. Now let's get ready to install our brand new nut onto the axle. Now we're just going to want to make sure we bottom this out by hand. You never want to tighten your axle nuts with an air gun because if you over tighten it, you might potentially damage your wheel bearing. The next thing we're going to do is continue on by torquing that axle nut. You'll notice that I have a pry bar going across this area all the way down to the ground. I have it safely on the studs so I'm not going to damage them. The reason why I have it like this is so as I try torquing this, it's not going to want to spin on me. At this point, I can torque this to 159 foot-pounds. Now stick with me here. This part's super important. Looking at the axle, you can tell that it has a slot in it. The reason why that is because you have to take a hammer and punch and drive the edge of this mounting nut down into that groove. That's going to help ensure that it remains in place while you're driving down the road. That looks good. Okay, let's get our wheel on here. Once you have it up on there, start on all of your lug nuts, then bottom each of them out. Once we get the wheel safely back on the ground, we'll torque each of these lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. Now with the wheels safely back on the ground, let's continue torquing each of our 21mm lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. The one area that you want to pay attention to on the hubcap is the area where the valve stem is supposed to go. Go ahead and line it up with the valve stem and then drive it into place. Make sure it's completely secured so it doesn't fall off while you're driving down the road. Now the next thing you do before you start up the vehicle is to make your way under the hood to the transmission dipstick. That's this right here. We'll carefully lift this up, wipe it off, and give it a quick inspection. Now looking at the dipstick itself, you're going to see that you have areas that have hatches on them. Those hatches are important to know because if you were to look at the lower one, that's the cold range, and up high is the hot range. Before we start up the car, you want to make sure you at least have some transmission fluid on the dipstick. Once you have, you can continue on by putting the dipstick back in, run it through all the gears, and then let it warm up for a couple minutes. While the vehicle's running on a flat level surface, go ahead and pull out the dipstick. Assuming it's still cool, it should be approximately in between these hatches. As it warms up, it should make its way up here. Now, as you saw when we removed our axle, we lost a lot of fluid, so of course you'd want to go ahead and add some. The area that you would add fluid would be right through this dipstick tube. Use a funnel and pour it slowly because it will burp up a little bit of air, which could potentially spit out a little bit of transmission fluid as well. The transmission fluid that you're going to want to use generally is a specific fluid. The fluid that you want to use is considered a TIV transmission fluid. You can either get a specialty fluid or you can even go with a universal. If you go with universal, just make sure looking at the back it says it covers the TIV fluid. Okay friends, we got the car back together. Now at this point, you want to go ahead and start up the vehicle and take it for a road test. While you're on your road test, listen for any funny noises. If you feel any chattering, it could be from that axle, maybe it's not seated properly. Other than that, make sure the transmission's shifting properly. If it seems like it's slipping or it's not gripping properly, double check that transmission fluid. If it's low, top it off with the proper fluid as I told you before. Aside from that, thanks for watching.